This section of notes, we're going to cover quite a bit of ground. We're going to cover several different ideas. We're going to look at ghettoization. We're going to look at transportation and infrastructure of cities. And then we're going to start and get pretty much completed with the political organization and urban planning. We're going to get all the way through suburbanization. That'll leave us with just comparative urbanization in the next section of notes. Hope you enjoy. First thing we're going to look at is ghettoization. This is where forced segregation limits residential choices. Ethnic or racial minorities may be confined to the older, low-cost housing areas, typically close to the city center. And there's 4 examples that I want to look at and show you. First is the early southern ghetto around Charleston and New Orleans. This is where African Americans were confined to small houses and to the back streets. Number 2, you've got the classic southern ghetto. After slavery was banished, newly freed blacks lived in small houses of poor quality on undesirable land. This was where social segregation was going on and where not everybody was equal in every business. Number 3, you also had early northern ghettos. As African Americans migrated to northern cities in the early 20th century, they competed for living spaces, often in high-density, deteriorating housing on the margins of central business districts or around the city center again. And then number 4, the classic northern ghetto. These early ghettos grew, often surrounding the central business district and then penetrating nearby low-rent housing areas. So these 4 examples are the examples in the United States, but the United States is not the only place where ghettos took place. We looked at how in Italy in ancient times you had the ghetto. We also, you could think back to World War II, and there were ghettos in Europe from the undesirable peoples who not necessarily were African Americans, but were of a different race.
Banks that loaned house buyers money clearly identified risky neighborhoods by redlining them and refusing to give out loans for houses there. This technique kept property values down in these ghettos and restricted the necessary flow of money for repairs and upkeep in the redlined neighborhoods.
Another practice that ensured racial segregation was blockbusting, when real estate agents would seek to sell a house in a white neighborhood to an African American for a very low price, and then use scare tactics to get white neighbors to sell. Commission exponentially grew for the agents, and neighborhoods rapidly transitioned to ghettos.
Blockbusting became illegal in the 1960s, but was replaced by racial steering, an attempt to change ghetto boundaries by showing houses to blacks in white neighborhoods and to whites in black neighborhoods. American cities experiencing industrialization are prone to ghettoization.
A city's infrastructure includes its transportation systems, such as airports, roads, docks, railways, taxis, and intercity transit systems. People in suburbs generally rely on motor vehicles.
People in cities rely on public transportation to combat rush hour.
Now moving on to political organization and urban planning. First thing I want to look at with you is zoning. Zoning ordinances first developed in Europe and North America in the early 20th century, encouraging spatial separation by preventing mixes of land uses within the same district, so that you could separate the different land and people couldn't share, and the different land wouldn't be mixed with what was going on with it. So they created zoning ordinances. In most of Asia, there's no zoning, and it is quite common to have mixed neighborhoods, both on the economic level and the business and residential use, because they're all mixed together because of no zoning. Then we move on to local government fragmentation. More metropolitan areas are calling for cooperation among local governments, with many metropolitan areas forming councils of government, or cooperative agencies consisting of representatives from local governments in the region so that they can all come to consensus on issues in relation to the city or the surrounding region, county, or anything in that means. Planning for growth. On the state level in the United States, there are steps to curb sprawl, limit traffic congestion, and reverse inner city decline have led to a movement called smart growth. The goal in smart growth is to produce controlled development so that it just doesn't grow and become unorganized in land use mix like we had before we had zoning. Urban renewal and gentrification. Many cities have targeted blighted inner city neighborhoods through urban renewal plans that allow the government to buy properties from the owners, relocate residents and businesses, clear the sites, and build new roads and utilities. So urban renewal is when you basically destroy and then rebuild. Often, public housing, which is reserved for low-income households, has been built and funded by the federal government, but managed by a local authority. On the flip side of urban renewal, we have what is known as gentrification. An alternative to demolishing deteriorating inner-city houses is to renovate them. Once housing in an area has been renovated, the neighborhood often begins to attract middle-class residents, a process called gentrification. Now, I got an example of gentrification for you, although it's not in the middle of a city, but there's a jailhouse in the little town of Benjamin, Texas, in Knox County. You might have heard of it before, probably not. But in Benjamin, Texas, there's a jailhouse. You can see its picture there on the left. There's a man by the name of Wyman Menzer who lives there presently. He updated the building. Instead of tearing it down, he owns the land. Instead of tearing it down, he went in and renovated the area, and it is a very luxurious house, even though from the outside it still looks like a jail. So although that's not in a city center, it's still gentrification because they're not demolishing, they're just renovating. And then we have suburbanization and edge cities. Suburbs in the United States began expanding after World War II as more people bought cars made more affordable by the mass assembly line production. Suburbs expanded rapidly in the post-World War II era as demand for new homes grew. The interstate highway system improved, and the GI Bill of Rights provided government-sponsored loans for veterans to buy houses. Very important to understand that about the GI Bill of Rights, giving loans to veterans to buy houses. That helped develop suburbs. The availability and low cost of land in the suburbs eventually led to the construction of mega stores like Walmart. These are huge stores with a wide variety of products designed for one-stop shopping so that you could get back home to your house in the suburbs. Today, United States cities have stopped their spatial growth because residents in outlying areas organize their own services rather than pay city taxes for these services. These legally independent areas may grow to become edge cities, defined by their own central business districts and other concentrations of office and commercial buildings that provide jobs for residents within their boundaries. Edge cities typically grow on the borders of large urban areas at points near major roads and airports. Although Wolfforth is not an example of an edge city because it doesn't really have a central business district, it is an example of a suburb because it's a community that developed as people moved outside of Lubbock to live in houses which were away from the city center. Chauncey Harris, creator of the multiple nuclei model that we just talked about earlier, describes the formation of edge cities through his peripheral model. An urban area consisting of an inner city and surrounded by large suburban residential and business areas.
The parts of the city are often connected by a beltway or ring road. As the distance increases from the center of the city, the density of residents and houses decreases, a change called the density gradient. The progressive development of landscape in the suburban areas is known as sprawl. This allows people to have larger houses and more land, but it also brings problems, such as wasting agricultural land, and in Europe, the supply of land for construction of new housing is more restricted than in the United States. So many cities surround themselves with green belts or rings of open space where houses may not be located. This tends to drive house prices up. This is attempting to encourage growth in the city's core.